Want to begin? Okay, okay, it's working. Want to begin with a couple announcements. First of all, 2 weeks ago when I had the class, the mic was not working right, and now it is working right. But as a result, it didn't record. If anyone wants to hear that, not done here, but I did it back in 2022 anyways, there at Southwest, and so I do have the link for that. If somebody wants that, I can give them to them afterwards. Second, the congregation has been talking about the subject of elders and wanting elders. And so I'd like you to begin to think about who is it in the congregation that we would be willing to follow as shepherds. What godly men would we be willing to follow as shepherds? And just be thinking about that and putting it on your mind and thinking about some of the different individuals, because we'll be looking at this a little bit more in a few weeks as we continue on. But today I want to deal with a subject that is a controversial subject. It's one of those that as we look around us in the world today, it's one of those that kind of can even split congregations. And that is the place of women in the assembly. Because of the feminist movement and in our culture, the role of women has been kind of altered from what it used to be, and we're told that what the scriptures teach, or that's old, that's archaic, or it's not even needed. It's not even essential. We can just get rid of it. When it comes to assembly, we find that what the scriptures teach about the role of men and women, even that is being challenged. And thus, one of the most controversial topics in the church today is dealing with God's assignment of gender roles. We come to passages like Ephesians, the 5th chapter, verse 22. Wives, subject yourself to your husbands as unto the Lord. Or 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of man, and that man is the head of woman, and that God is the head of Christ. And as we come to these passages, we find a lot of conflict in our society. Battle lines have been drawn, even in churches, over this type of subject or over this subject. And some in applying it, or they say, well, let's just abandon it altogether, that was something cultural back for that period of time. The issue comes up, time after time after time. The question becomes, can women teach, preach, or take an active role of leadership in the assembly? Or are they limited to certain actions by God? Before we begin to really dig into this subject, I want to make it very clear that in no way does God's Word teach that women are second-class citizens. They are fellow heirs of the grace of God with us. We are joint heirs in the kingdom of Christ. The fact is, there are women that are probably far more knowledgeable than many men. And there are women that have great ability to teach, maybe even greater than some men, and to convey the truth. So it's not a question of ability or of worth. We're not talking about that. It's a question of role. And that's the question, what did God say about the role of women in the assembly and why? And I saw your hand. I am going to be open for, this is going to be a discussion. Unlike the last class where I had to rush through real quick, I do have, if you want questions, got questions. If they are going to be dealt with later, I don't mind telling you, hold it, we'll be dealing with it later. Did you have Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're just different areas because one can't do both areas, all the areas. So yeah. That glorifies Christ when both are operated, functioning in the way God did. Yeah. And hopefully as we go through this study, we'll see that even more so taking place. What I want to do is we're going to look at three primary scriptures. 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, verse 8 through 15. 1 Corinthians 14 chapter, verse 34 and 35, then 1 Corinthians 11 chapter, verses 2 through 16 anyways. We probably won't get to the last one until next week. And we'll see whether we get to the first two this week. But also, as we go through it, is it working? It's not working. Is it turned on or? Oh, okay. Yeah. As we go through each one of these passages, we're going to be, first of all, looking at the context surrounding the passage. Then we're going to be looking at the passage in detail, doing a word study. And then after that, we'll come back and make some applications from what we've learned in the passage. But before we begin, one of the first things, there it goes. It's probably going to go overboard on me now. But one of the first things, or the first points that we need to ask, or the first question we need to ask and answer is, whose church is it? And really and truly, this question may sound like a silly question, but when we're dealing with a subject like this, or any subject in areas that there might be any type of controversy, we need to ask the question, whose church is it? When we're addressing the question of a woman's role in the assembly, we need to ask the question, whose church is it? As we begin to look at the New Testament, we find that it says that God purchased the church with his Son's precious blood. Acts 20, verse 28. Since God purchased the church, since God bought the church, then it is God's church. And since it is God's church, he is the owner. He is the one who makes the final decisions on how his church should operate and how his church should be, or what his church should be like. Maybe I could use a kind of a crude illustration, but an illustration from life. Suppose you buy a new home, and it says subdivision, and all the neighbors come up to you and say, you need to paint your home hot pink. Because all the other homes in the neighborhood are hot pink. So you need to be like all the other homes in the neighborhood and paint your house hot pink. What are you going to do? Who gets, pardon? Yeah. Who gets to decide what color you're going to paint the house? You do. You're the owner. Okay. I know I know that I said it's a crude illustration. I know there's exceptions. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing. The corollary to that is, well, if you have a few glasses of wine or something like that, read Marxism, it sounds okay, maybe even great. And what does it yield over the last 100 years? Tens of millions of people slaughtered, countries, economies destroyed. That's people implementing what sounds like a good thing. So when you have people, things go wrong.
Yeah. And that's why, like I said, it was a crude illustration, but I was trying to point out the fact that only the owner gets to decide what they're going to do with what they own. Nobody else gets to make that decision. God owns the church. He paid a very high price for the church, the blood of his only begotten Son. And since he owns it, he's the only one who gets to decide what the church is to be like and what the church is to do. And even if our culture says we can do it differently, or our culture says that the role of men and women aren't that important anymore, or even they're cross-gender and all the other stuff, God has already told us in his church, this is the way it's going to be. And so we're going to be looking at what did God say about this in his church by looking at the scriptures. First passage he wants to turn to, okay, I did have that question up there. So the question becomes, according to the owner, what is the role of women in the church? And perhaps more specifically, who gets to lead in the public worship assembly? And so we're going to start with 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter. Kind of the context of the chapter, or the book anyways. 1 Timothy was written to Timothy by the Apostle Paul. He was a young evangelist, and he was a traveling companion with Paul. He was sent out by Paul many times to work with various congregations. The purpose of the book is found in chapter 3 and verses 14 through 15. Oops, I got 2 Timothy. That don't read very good. 1 Timothy 3, 14 through 15. He says, I'm writing these things to you, hoping to come to you before long. But in case I am delayed, I'm writing so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the support of the truth. So Paul was telling Timothy, as a church leader, that he's writing this so that he knows what he should teach, what he should preach, how he should set in order the church of God. Timothy this is actually an instruction manual, 1 Timothy, to him of how do we do it in the church. What is the church supposed to be like? What are we supposed to do in our assembly? And what's the assembly supposed to be like? And thus, it shouldn't surprise us that we find in 1 Timothy instructions for the church and what the church is to be doing. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, he starts by dealing with a number of different instructions. He talks about the prayer, regarding prayer, and then he gives instructions a little bit later about elders and deacons and their qualifications. He goes on to exhorting them for the need of sound doctrine, to treatment of widows and the instructions to the rich. All these are things regarding the church and what the church is to be like. We must notice that these are also not for one specific church. It wasn't for just the church at Ephesus or wherever. Paul is writing this for all churches. These are instructions for all churches. Timothy would be working with a number of different churches, and in every one of them, the same requirements would be needed. It wasn't something from one church, another for a different church. At Corinth, one thing, Ephesus, another. It was for all the churches. Therefore, the instructions regarding women are not just for one congregation or one area, but we can assume they're for all churches of all ages, and not just for the church in the first century in Asia Minor. And so with this, let's go ahead and start to dig into the scriptures, going back to chapter 2 and verse 8. He begins with the word Adar, which is man. It's very gender-specific, meaning men and men only. Paul tells us that God wants men only, to pray at all times. Simply, whenever or wherever men and women are gathered together for the purpose of maybe assembly or worship, men are to be leading in the prayer. And then we come to verses 9 and 10, and there he gives instructions regarding the adorning of women, or godly women, what they are to wear. Then we come to verses 11 and 12, and we have a couple words here. The word quietly and quiet. They both come from the exact same Greek word, haketos anyways, but Thayer defines this word two different ways. It can either be quietness, describing a life of one who stays at home and does their work at home, is not needling or meddling in the affairs of others, or it can be silence. It can be translated either way. While the word certainly could refer to total silence or complete silence or being without speech, More often, it refers to the idea of simply leading a quiet life. And that's found in passages like 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 11 and 12, excuse me, Acts 22, verse 2. Another Greek word that Paul will use for total silence is found in 1 Corinthians 14. But that's not the word Paul is using here. Rather, as we put it in context, we're referring back to verses 10 and 11, where it's talk about the women and how they are to be living a certain lifestyle. I think that's more the context of what he's saying here, is that the women are to be to live disciplined lives and not be busybodies, poking their noses into everybody else's business and going around, but rather to be quiet and humble lifestyle. Dom. Okay, thank you.
And they were not allowed to say one word.
Yeah.
Go against what really the intent of the scripture was. He says it was such a shock because all the men were sitting down and all the women were standing around the perimeter of the auditorium because they took the wrong definition.
Yeah. And we'll see that more when we get into 1 Corinthians 14 than here. But there you go even a step further with the standing. And if you take it out of context, it can mean anything. That's why we got to look at passages in context. And that's why I want to approach it that same way. And so he continues on. Some other words is the word teach and the words exercise authority. The word teach is simply teach. I mean, there's no other definition of that. That's all it means, teach. But the word exercise authority means to exercise authority on one's own account, or to domineer over, or to usurp authority, or to have dominion over. And what is significant about these two words is the Greek verb tense. And in our English language, we don't see this, but in the Greek language, the verb tense means something. It tells us something about what the author is trying to say. There's a tremendous difference in the Greek language between the aorist tense and the present tense. The aorist tense denotes a single action, where the present tense denotes an action that is continuing on time after time after time. Using an illustration, to sin. In the aorist tense, that would be, if it's in the aorist tense, a single sin. I committed a sin. If it's in the present tense, I'm living a life of sin. I'm sinning all the time. The word that Paul used here, or the Greek tense that Paul used here, is that in the present tense. And he's talking about the fact that they are not just one time that they're teaching or usurping authority, but it's a continuous act of being of teaching or exercising or taking authority over or domineering over. Literally, Paul was saying, I do not permit women to teach or to be one who continually exercises authority over men in the church. She is not to take over a class, for example, and exercise authority when men are present. She's not to assume the role of a teacher. Can she ask a question? Yes. But can she take over his teaching? He says no. That one time there's the aorist tense, but he's using the present tense. She can't take over that leadership role. Asking a question isn't a leadership role, but she's not to take over that leadership role. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to that. We will get to that. Yeah.
God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and they have a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Same in the family, the same in the church.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to understand God's hierarchy. Now, some of the angels left their proper role, their hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want men or women
Yeah. And we'll see that more next week when we get to 1 Corinthians 11. And we're going to get to that in just a minute here, too, a little bit. But the fact is, she's not to domineer over or to assume authority over in a teaching situation where men are present in the congregation or in the church. And so he goes on in verse 11, he uses one other word, that is the word submissive. And this word is basically the same word that's found in Ephesians 5, verse 22, where wives are to be submissive or to submit to their husbands. The word does not require silence, but it does require her taking a secondary role. And we ask the question, why? I forgot to hit that. We ask the question, why? Going back to verse 13 and 14, we find the answer. He says, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So the reason why women are not permitted to teach or take that leadership role or that role of authority, he's taking all the way back to creation. And two different things that he mentions here, first of all, is the order of creation. Who was created first? Go back to Genesis chapter 1. And chapter 2. I mean, when we talk about that. But, he was created first. God created Adam for a purpose, to take care of his creation. He created Eve for a purpose. And what was that to be? To be that helpmeet to man. To help him in all, this creation's big. To help him in all the things that he be, to be that co-partner. Genesis tells us that the woman's created for man and not man for the woman. So he goes back and he uses the order of creation. The second thing is the order of the fall. It's not man who was deceived, but it was the woman who was deceived. Did man sin? Was he deceived? No. Man knew totally what he was doing when he partook of that. Whatever, but he already knew what God had said, and he willfully disobeyed God. That the woman was deceived first, but it simply goes back to the order of creation. So this is why Paul says these rules are necessary, because of the order of creation and because of the order of the fall. And so what applications can we learn from this? First of all, God desires that at all times, in all places, when men and women are gathered together for a purpose of teaching and preaching, or prayer or whatever, men are to do the leading. Women are to be dressed in modesty and discreetly and live quiet lives. Women are expressly prohibited from leading prayer, teaching, or exercising authority over men on these occasions. The reason for this has to do with the created role that God has given to, or creative role God has given to women. Their role was not originating with Paul. It isn't, as some say, well, this is a first century thing. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. Back to Genesis. Actually, go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. We might just flip back there real quickly. After the fall, this is what God said to the woman. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth, and in pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he will rule over you. So it's going all the way back to the very beginning of time. This is what God has decreed. When women remove themselves from this role that God has designated or ordered, and they begin to lead in prayer or teaching or study or whatever, it's without biblical authority. They're going beyond what the Scriptures teach. And when a woman insists upon taking over or usurping authority, it is sin. Just like any other sin, but it is sin. It's going beyond what God has specified. Okay, Tom?
So, if a woman is teaching a young downstairs and there are believers there, she is exercising authority over
Okay.
those young men that are in that class.
Okay.
Is that, I'm asking in reference to your
Okay. Those are questions that do come up on this. I think we can raise, kind of exceptions in a class. What about a mother teaching her boys at home? I see this more, what Paul's, again, in the church, and yes, that's in the church, but in the assembly where we're together, that women are to take that subservient role. They are not to be standing up, and we're going to see this a lot more when we get into 1 Corinthians 11th chapter, or the 14th chapter, they're not to be standing up and saying, we get a right to, or we get an opportunity to. I have a gift that I need to be using, and so I'm going to use it regardless of what anybody says. And where was that taking place? Of course, that was in the assembly. And so, but those are some questions that do come up, and even in the home, sometimes that, is it right or wrong? I think that's not what Paul's talked about here.
So you said it's more about the setting.
Yeah. But in the home, even there's a different thing. That's why wives are to be submissive to their husbands in the home. That's a different setting. That's a different place. Here we're talking about the church, in the church, in the assembly. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jesus was submissive to the Father, and we as men need to be submissive to Him, Christ, our head. So again, it's all about order, and when we fulfill that order, it's a beautiful thing, just like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Different roles, but all accomplished.
Okay. How long do I have to? 15 after? I don't think we're going to. Okay.
We might even point out the Ten Commandments back when, when we're talking about male children, children were to honor their father and their mother as well. So, in the youth at least, the young men would have to at least submit to their mothers in honor.
Yeah. And children submit to their parents, even in the New Testament. That's what Paul says. Okay, let's go ahead and at least, hopefully we'll see how far we get. 1 Corinthians 14 and 15. The context here is, as we look at the Corinthian church, they had some very serious problems. Any student of the Bible knows that this church had more problems than any other congregation that we read of. Paul wrote to them to deal with some of the very serious problems they were having. There's division, there's worldly wisdom, carnality, there's arrogance, there's immorality, there are lawsuits, there's marriage problems, there's the question over meat that was offered to idols and eating that meat, the abuse of the Lord's Supper, and the misuse of the miraculous gifts. All these things were taking place in Corinth. But also, as we look at the congregation at Corinth, it was blessed with many gifted individuals in the congregation. In fact, it seems like that this is one of the few congregations in the New Testament that had a lot of members that had miraculous or spiritual gifts. And so they're very blessed above many other congregations. But what should have been a blessing actually became a curse, because they began to be jealous over one another and over the gifts that they had compared to the gift that somebody else had. And in their competition, they left out love. And divisions began to occur, and chaos began to occur. And as we come to chapter 14, the the most noticeable gifts anyways, was that of prophecy and tongues. And they've been abused. Both of these were things that would be used in the public assembly. The prophesying and the gift of tongues were both things that you would be speaking. And of course, they're talking about things that you've never studied. Maybe you never learned that language. The gifts of prophecy will be revealing thoughts from God, because remember, they did not have the New Testament. This is what God wants us to do. And apparently the tongue speakers were standing around and they would speak when there wasn't an interpreter. And the prophecy people, they get up and they start talking, and another one say, I got a prophecy, and they'd start talking at the same time, and you'd have 3 or 4 people all talking in the congregation at the same time, and it's total, complete confusion. And thus Paul, in 1 Corinthians 14 chapter, verse 27 through 30, says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by 2 or at the most 3, and each in turn, and one must interpret. But if there's no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. And let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made, and another who is seated, the first one must keep silent. So Paul's calling for order in the church. And in the midst of all this competition, now we have some of the women who are also getting involved. And they're seeing, well, all this is going on. We need to step up as well. Did some of the women have these gifts? Yes. Some of them could prophesy. Some of them could speak in tongues. Some of them could interpret, such as Philip. He had 4 virgin daughters that were prophetesses. And so they were looking at this. Well, everybody else is doing it. Let's jump up and let's do it too. And so Paul is going to come back again and deal with this situation as we look at this passage. And so come back to verse 34 and 35. It says, and the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to be subject themselves, just as the Lord or the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in the church. And so as we begin our study, digging in, the first word we find is gune, which is woman. Gender specific, just like man. He's not talking to everyone. He's talking to the women. And what does he say to them? They are to keep silent. This word means total silence. No speech. Unlike 1 Timothy chapter 2, where the word meant quiet, here he means total silence. Again, the verb is important, or the tense of the verb is important. This is not aorist tense, this is present tense. They're not to keep silent once in a while, they're to keep silent all of the time in the assembly. Paul's not saying that she can be silent for a moment, but she's to maintain an attitude or a life of silence. This same word is used also in several other times here. For example, in verse 28, it says, and if there's no interpreter, he must keep silent. He must be silent. Verse 30, if a revelation is made and another one is seated, the first one must keep silent. You don't start talking when the other person's talking. That's the word that's used here. And so he says that she is to be silent. She's not permitted. The Greek word means to allow or to give permission to. No one has given her permission to speak in the assembly. Well, what if the elders say she can speak? Remember who's saying this? Whose church is it? What does God say? It doesn't matter what the elders say. It doesn't matter what the preacher says. It doesn't matter what the nation says or our culture says. What does God say? Okay.
It has to do with letting things be done for the purpose of edification and building up.
Yeah.
That's why you don't want somebody, in the early church, they had the Baptist measure of gifts to build the infant church up. You didn't have Bibles like we have.
Yeah.
The thing is that even the men needed to be in order. Like,
Yeah.
one talk at a time, etc.
Yeah.
So it's all just about letting
Yeah.
things be done
Yeah.
decently and
Yeah. And that is that's why we come back to the context. This is the context in which it's occurring that Paul is giving these. And so he says that they're not permitted, and then he uses the word to speak. This word literally means to speak, to talk, to utter, or to emit a sound. So is Paul here contradicting 1 Timothy 2? Because in 1 Timothy 2, he kind of gave the idea that she could at least say a word. Now is he saying she can't say a single thing? Must she remain absolutely, completely silent in the assembly? Okay?
First Timothy 2, he says in every place, and uses the word quiet. Here, he's speaking about the assembly where the Lord's Supper is being taken, which we
Yeah.
would typically call the worship service.
Yeah.
And so here, the silence there, but there's other commands where we are to sing to one another, which would include women. And so there's a context, I think, to the silence here, which is
Okay.
the role of teaching, preaching, addressing the congregation.
Okay.
In that sense, not whispering to your child.
Okay. Yeah, we need to look at the word speaking as it's used in the context here. What is she not to speak? And it's used in chapter 13, verse 1, if I speak with the tongue of men and angels. Chapter 14 and verse 1, pursue love, yet desire earnestly the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. Let's see, did I have verse 1 or verse 2? I had the wrong one. For anyone who speaks in a tongue, and verse 3, but one who prophesies speaks to men. Verse 4, one who speaks in a tongue. Verse 5, now I wish that you all spoke in tongues. Verse 6, now brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, and then drop down to verse 13, therefore let anyone who speaks in a tongue pray, and so forth. Verse 19, however, in the church I desire to speak 5 words with my mind, and so that I may instruct others. And then in verse, 21, in the law it is written, by men of strange tongues and by the lips of strangers I will speak to this people. Verse 27, if anyone speaks in a tongue, and then verse 29, but if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. And so all the way through here, as we look at this, these 11 verses emphasize the type of speaking Paul is talking about here. He's talking about speaking in tongues or in prophecy. Women are not to be doing this in the assembly. Both of the roles would involve a speaker standing up or in front of a group of people leading their thoughts, leading their ideas. Both involved teaching. And so notice Paul was not prohibiting women from participating in the assembly, that of singing songs and maybe saying an occasional amen, or saying something to their child, or maybe even explaining what's going on in the assembly or something that has been said. What he is dealing with is women getting up and taking an active leadership role in the assembly. In that area, she is to be silent. She's not to speak up. Okay. Okay. Women, there are other, that's one of the things, a little bit later I'll get into some of the things that women can do. There are many areas where women can use their gifts. Women are to be teaching other women. There are times when men probably shouldn't be doing it because women know a lot better, how to teach other women. There are other occasions, maybe with their children or other areas. We know that Aquila and Priscilla, they were out studying the Bible together. She could be able to teach there in that situation as well as him. Here we're talking about in the assembly. Does that help answer your question? Okay. Okay.
It doesn't say earlier when it talks about when the prophesying, it doesn't give any limitations on them. I don't know, in Acts 2, I don't know where there's any limitations on these things. But I think in this situation, he uses silence 3 times, as you pointed out, and the other 2 times he says doesn't mean that's the silence. He says the one means that's the silence. I think it's more of an attitude thing, the way they were being boisterous. It would be the same for men. I think the same exact thing you could say about men in that situation.
Yeah.
The situational thing, I don't think is.
Yeah. Well, in 1 Timothy, the word silence is not total, complete silence. The word silence here in 1 Corinthians that Paul uses time after time after time is complete silence in the assembly. And he's using it we know 1 Corinthians 14 is specifically dealing with the assembly. Actually starting in chapter 11, verse 2, I think it is, through the end of chapter 14. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that is he can speak to God, and that Paul says that if you have that gift of tongues, you can speak to God. But if there is no interpreter in the congregation, no, you cannot do it in the congregation. No one's understanding. Who are you edifying? In our own private meetings, in our own hopefully we have private Bible study, we have time with God, and we spend that time with God. You know, that's where we can be, he says, you can exercise that gift in that situation. But if there's no interpreter in the assembly, you are to be silent. Okay?
Like when they were in Tanzania, if you know, if you didn't have Ezekiel translating for you, they wouldn't have understood
Yeah.
what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's where I wish I had the gift of a language. Okay, I'll go over here.
like Lydia was, they were women out on
Mhm.
the river, and they were worshiping, and they could prophesy
Yes.
to each other.
Yes. Okay, that's over here and then back up here.
Like Bertie said, when we're singing together, women are co-teaching with men, but the whole idea is not usurping authority over. That's what
Yeah.
we're trying to talk about God before.
Yeah.
So as long as, the prophetess was he was talking about, they were always submissive to the leaders.
Yeah.
Like Deborah. She only did it led because King wouldn't, and it was a shame, and she told him that. I mean, so in every case, even like you pointed out, that
Yeah.
Apollos,
Yeah. And that'll be the next word that will be, yeah.
he didn't teach over Apollos.
Yeah.
He was with him.
Yeah. And that'll be the next word we'll be looking at as we continue on, but over here. Okay. But that does not, just because that there's those type of situation does not change what the scriptures say. That means then we need to figure out how we can work in that situation in line with the scriptures. And there are ways to do it. There are women that have done that they have men that will not get up and teach. They will not get up and preach, or maybe they're not even members of the church. There are ways around that and still staying true to the scriptures. You know, we can't use a straw hat and say, well, we can do it over here. Well, if we can do it over here, then we can do it over here. We've seen that happen too many times in the church with things like, hey, I'll get on my hobby. Praise teams. We need to have a praise team here. Why do we need to have a praise team? So that our songs can sound better. And we'll have the 4-part harmony. But we'll let them, you know, they'll have mics, but they'll sit out in the auditorium, you know, so they won't be up. But what happens very long after that? Next thing, they're up here on the front row. And then they're up in front. And then before very long, we have the things that we're seeing right here. And like I said, I'm getting on a hobby, but if we start departing from the Scripture even a little bit, saying, well, this case is unique. Well, there's a lot of unique cases. We can look at, as you said, Philippi. What do we know about Philippi? When Paul was there, he left with one man that had no idea about the Bible. That's a Philippian jailer who had been baptized, and his family, and Lydia. There may have been some others. What are we going to say? Are we going to, make up a whole new thing? No. They followed the same thing Paul said here. How they did it, we don't know. The Scriptures are not, the Scriptures don't give us all the answers. The Scriptures give us the guideline that God expects. And He's given us enough wisdom that we can look at it and we can find ways. As, for example, a lot of women I know have taken and they either have got DVDs or different things like that, and some of them will watch TV, now with our modern technology, watch the program like North Mac or Southwest or something like that. There are options that we can keep with the Scriptures. Okay.
In Moab, we were there, and I think Marty's heard this. There's a church in Delta, Utah, where there is only women in there, and there's unbelieving men in that situation. And the women conduct the service, but as soon as one of us that come from the outside steps through the door, they stop all their teaching, all their singing, all their preaching. Because there is no man there. They recognize their role in that little church that's in Delta, Utah.
Yeah. Did we run out of time? Is that what's it? I thought, well, we didn't quite get through it. But the next word that I'll just throw this up here. The next word was subject themselves. That this will help a little bit in tying it in with the context. And then we'll get into the, if they desire to know anything. I think it's rather interesting when you look at the Greek words that are used here. It really shows a different standpoint than what our English language is saying. And so we'll end here. Next week we'll get into that. Hopefully we'll get through 2 Corinthians 11. 2 Corinthians 11, there's a lot more there than meets the eye. You just kind of read through it, and we center in on the wrong thing. We miss what Paul is really trying to deal with many times. And so thank you for all the comments. Let me put my notes here. Yeah. You're talking about the